My name is Jessica Monroe. I'm 29 years old. I'll never forget the night my own mother screamed in my face, "You're just a leech living off us," before throwing my bags into the street like I was trash. That night changed everything. The screen door slammed shut, its rattle echoing in the sudden cold silence. My mother's face was a twisted mask of fury, her eyes narrowed to slits. The porch light cast a harsh yellow glow on the scene, making it feel like a badly lit stage play. My 2 duffel bags and a cardboard box of my art supplies sat on the damp lawn, thrown there with a force that felt personal and violent. One of the bags had split open, and a few of my favorite sweaters spilled out onto the wet grass, looking like wounded animals. "You're just a leech living off us." Before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. The words were still ringing in my ears, bouncing around in the hollow space that had just opened up in my chest. A leech. It was a word meant to make me feel disgusting, parasitic, and worthless. It worked. I stood there on the porch steps, the cold of the concrete seeping through my thin socks, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My father stood in the doorway, his silhouette a dark, unmoving shape against the warm light of the living room. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My older brother, Kyle, was visible just over his shoulder, a faint, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. That was the moment I understood. It wasn't just my mother's sudden rage. It was a family decision, an unspoken verdict that had finally been delivered. I was being exiled. The warmth, the laughter, the smell of dinner cooking, it was all inside that house, and I was on the outside, cast into the dark. That night, standing on the curb with my life in 2 bags and a box, I felt a kind of cold I'd never known. It wasn't just the damp Portland air. It was the chilling, absolute certainty that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just put a price on that love, and apparently I could no longer afford it. That night changed everything. It had to, because I had finally, truly run out of things to lose. Growing up in our Portland home was an exercise in understanding emotional gravity. The house itself was a beautiful 2-story craftsman on a tree-lined street, the kind of place that magazines feature in articles about idyllic family life. My mother, Ellen, kept a pristine garden of rose bushes out front, and my father, Robert, always made sure the lawn was perfectly manicured. From the outside, we were the perfect family, but inside, the laws of physics were different. My older brother, Kyle, was the sun, a massive, blazing star around which everything and everyone else was forced to orbit. I was a distant, cold moon, reflecting a tiny fraction of his light, and valued only for how my presence made his shine brighter. Kyle was 2 years older, and he was born with a blueprint for success that my parents understood. He was logical, athletic, and good with numbers. He was a miniature version of my father, and they saw his future as a straight, clear line leading to wealth and respectability. Their praise for him was the background noise of my childhood, a constant, flowing river of validation. Kyle got the highest score on the math test in his entire grade, my father would announce at dinner, his chest puffed out with pride. "Of course he did," my mother would reply, beaming. "He has a good head on his shoulders. He's going to be someone important." I, on the other hand, was a puzzle they had no interest in solving. While Kyle was memorizing multiplication tables, I was discovering the magic of mixing watercolors to create the exact shade of a sunset. While he was practicing layups in the driveway, I was filling sketchbooks with the faces of people I saw. At the park, my world was made of color, texture, light, and shadow. It was a language my parents didn't speak, and their response was to treat it as a frivolous, childish dialect that I would hopefully, eventually outgrow. They didn't see my passion. They saw a hobby, a distraction from the real work of becoming a responsible adult. This dynamic was carved in stone by 1,000 tiny moments. I remember the ritual of report cards in elementary school. Kyle would stride into the living room, waving his perfect all-A's report card like a victory flag. This would trigger an immediate celebration. We would all pile into the car and go out for ice cream sundaes. He would be allowed to get extra toppings, a tangible reward for his quantifiable success. I would bring home my own report card, with A's in English and art, and B's in math and science. My father would scan the paper, his finger tracing the lines. "These B's need to come up, Jessica," he would say, his tone serious. "You have to focus on the important subjects. Art won't get you a job." There was no ice cream for my A's. My achievements were invisible next to my perceived failures. I learned early on that their love was conditional, and the conditions were written in a language I couldn't speak. When we entered high school, the chasm between us widened. Kyle enrolled in every advanced placement math and science class available. He joined the debate team and was voted team captain. His path was clear, and my parents paved it for him with tutors, expensive calculators, and endless encouragement. I wanted to take advanced studio art and creative writing. This led to a tense dinner table summit. "What is the point of that, Jessica?" my father asked, genuinely bewildered. "It's not practical," my mother chimed in, her voice laced with that familiar tone of gentle disappointment. "Honey, you need to think about your future. Your brother is building a resume for college. You're just doodling." I tried to explain that it was more than doodling, that it was what I was good at, what I loved, but it was like trying to describe color to someone who could only see in black and white. They reluctantly signed the permission slip, but their disapproval was a heavy blanket that smothered my excitement. The ultimate symbol of our differing value came when we turned 16. For Kyle's 16th birthday, my parents surprised him with a used but reliable Toyota. It was a huge deal. There was a big red bow on the hood, and all our relatives came over for a barbecue to celebrate his entry into adulthood and mobility. The car represented their trust in him, their investment in his future. A year and a half later, my 16th birthday arrived. There was a cake and a few presents, but no car. When I cautiously asked about it, my father's response was swift and logical. "Your brother is responsible. And besides, we helped him with a down payment, but he has a part-time job to pay for his own gas and insurance. If you want a car, you need to learn to be responsible like him and earn it." The irony was staggering. I already had a part-time job at a local bookstore, saving every penny for art supplies and, I had hoped, for a car. The money Kyle earned from his job bagging groceries was for video games and dates. But in their narrative, he was the responsible one, and I needed to be taught a lesson. So, for 2 years, I took the city bus to school and to my job, while his car sat in the driveway. The lesson I learned wasn't the one they intended. I learned that in our family, responsibility was just a code word for being the favored child. By the time college applications rolled around, the script was set. My parents hired a private counselor to help Kyle perfect his essays for business school. They paid for him to visit 3 different university campuses out of state. His future was a family project, a blue-chip stock they were all investing in. When my turn came, I was on my own. I dreamed of attending the Rhode Island School of Design. I showed them the brochure, my hands trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. My father glanced at the tuition fees and let out a low whistle. "Absolutely not," he said, closing the brochure. "We are not paying that kind of money for you to get an art degree. It's a complete waste." My mother tried to soften the blow. "Maybe you could look at the state college, honey. They have an art program. You could live at home." Living at home was the last thing I wanted. It would be a cage. So, I spent nights in my room, secretly filling out applications and financial aid forms by myself. I wrote essays, curated my portfolio, and sent it all off into the void, praying for a miracle. The miracle came in the form of a thick envelope from a prestigious design college in California, offering me a significant scholarship. I was ecstatic, floating on air. I ran downstairs to show my parents the acceptance letter, the proof that someone, somewhere, valued what I did. My father read the letter, focusing only on the financial aid section. "Well," he said, handing it back to me, "at least we don't have to pay for most of it." My mother hugged me, but her words were, "California is so far away. Are you sure you can handle being on your own?" There was no celebration. There was no pride. Here was only relief that their financial burden had been lifted and doubt that I was capable of surviving without them. I went to college feeling not like a daughter they were proud of, but like a problem they had finally, thankfully, managed to outsource. Independence was like air. I didn't realize how vital it was until it was gone. For 3 years after college, I breathed the sweet, clean air of my own life in a small but sunny apartment in downtown Portland. I had a job as a junior graphic designer at a boutique marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay wasn't great, but it was mine. I paid my own rent, bought my own groceries, and made my own decisions. I was building a life on my own terms, far from the suffocating gravitational pull of my family. For the first time, I felt like I was becoming a person, not just someone's sister or someone's daughter. The email that destroyed it all arrived on a gray Tuesday morning. It was from HR, its subject line a sterile and ominous, corporate, Restructuring announcement. The body of the email was filled with cold corporate jargon, streamlining operations, synergizing assets, eliminating redundancies. At the very bottom was a list of employee numbers. I scanned the list, my heart pounding, and there it was, JM294, my number. I was a redundancy. I was told to pack the personal items from my desk and that my final paycheck would be mailed to me. Just like that, the life I had so carefully constructed was demolished. The first few weeks were a blur of denial and frantic activity. I polished my resume, updated my online portfolio, and sent out dozens of applications a day. I told myself it was just a temporary setback, a bump in the road. But the job market was brutal. The rejection emails piled up, each one a small, sharp jab to my dwindling confidence. My savings, which had once seemed like a healthy cushion, began to look terrifyingly small. The rent check cleared, then the car payment, then the utility bills. I watched my bank account balance shrink with a growing sense of panic. Soon, I was living on instant noodles and hope, and I was running out of both. I started selling my old college textbooks online for a few extra dollars. I canceled my streaming subscriptions. I stopped meeting friends for coffee. My world became smaller and smaller, confined to the four walls of my apartment, where the silence was broken only by the sound of my own anxious thoughts. The day my landlord slid a notice under my door, a polite but firm reminder that rent was due in 1 week, I knew I was out of options. The thought of calling my parents filled me with a profound sense of dread and humiliation. It felt like admitting defeat, like proving them right after all these years. They were right. My art degree was useless, my career was a failure, and I couldn't make it on my own. I stared at my mother's contact in my phone for a full hour, my thumb hovering over the call button. I imagined the conversation, her disappointed sighs, the inevitable, "I told you so." It was almost physically painful, but the alternative, a homeless shelter, sleeping in my car, was even more terrifying. Swallowing every last scrap of my pride, I pressed the button. "Hi, Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I explained the situation in a rush of nervous, apologetic words. The layoff, the job search, the empty bank account. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could picture her standing in the kitchen, pinching the bridge of her nose, the way she did when she was deeply annoyed. "Oh, Jessica," she finally said, and the disappointment in her voice was as thick as I had imagined. "I knew that little design firm wasn't stable. You should have tried to get a job in a real industry, like your brother." I bit my tongue to stop myself from screaming. I didn't need a lecture. I needed help. "I know," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. I need a place to stay, just for a little while, just until I can get back on my feet. I'll pay rent. I'll help out, I promise." Another sigh, longer and more theatrical this time. "I suppose," she said, her voice dripping with reluctance, "your old room is full of your father's old gym equipment, so you'll have to clear it out. And this isn't a free ride. We expect you to contribute, and you need to be looking for a proper job every single day." "I will," I promised, a pathetic wave of relief washing over me. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you." I hung up and slid down the wall to the floor, my body shaking. I wasn't sure if I was crying from relief or from shame. Moving back home was a regression in every sense of the word. The physical act of packing up my apartment felt like dismantling my own identity. Each box I filled was a piece of my independence being stored away. The drive to my parents' house was silent and heavy. When I walked through the front door, dragging my boxes behind me, I felt like a failure. My old bedroom was even worse than she had described. It was a dusty, forgotten storage space. It took me an entire day to move the rusty weight bench and boxes of old financial records to the garage, just to make room for my mattress on the floor. I was determined to be the perfect, grateful, temporary tenant. The day I moved in, I transferred a large chunk of my last paycheck to my father's bank account, with the memo, rent and utilities. I took over the grocery shopping, using my credit card to fill their pantry and refrigerator with all their favorite foods. I started cooking dinner every night, cleaning the kitchen spotless afterward. I did all the laundry, mowed the lawn, and even weeded my mother's precious rose garden. My brother and his wife, Sarah, quickly caught on to the new arrangement and began treating me like a built-in, on-call babysitter. A typical Friday night would start with a text from Kyle. "Hey, Sarah and I have dinner plans. Can you watch the kids? We'll be back around 10. It was never a question. It was a demand. I'd spend my evenings corralling my energetic niece and nephew, reading them stories, giving them baths and tucking them into bed. I loved them, but I was exhausted. Kyle and Sarah would breeze in hours later than they said, smelling of wine and expensive perfume. They would hand me a crumpled $20 bill and say, "Thanks, Jess. Here's something for your trouble." The gesture was more insulting than getting nothing at all. It solidified my new role, the unpaid help. Despite all my contributions, my efforts remained invisible to my parents. My mother, in particular, seemed to go out of her way to remind me of my dependent status. One afternoon, after spending 6 hours sending out resumes, I sat on the living room couch for a few minutes to rest my eyes. She walked in, saw me, and put her hands on her hips. "This isn't a hotel, Jessica," she said sharply. "If you have time to sit around, you have time to clean out the rain gutters." Another time, she saw me come home with a single cup of coffee from a local cafe, my one small treat for the week. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Should you really be spending money on luxuries like that when you don't have a job?" I felt like I was walking on eggshells in the house I grew up in. I was constantly trying to anticipate their needs, to be useful, to be unobtrusive. I was paying my way with money, with labor, and with my own dissolving sense of self. I was 29 years old, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a storage room, and being treated like a lazy, irresponsible teenager. The air of independence I had breathed for 3 years was a distant memory. I was suffocating, and I was starting to forget what it even felt like to take a full, deep breath. Sundays became a form of psychological torture. That was the day Kyle and his family would come over for the obligatory weekly dinner, and the day my status as the family's resident failure was put on full, glorious display. The air in the house would shift hours before they arrived. My mother would start cleaning surfaces that were already clean, a nervous energy buzzing around her. She'd change her clothes twice. The entire household seemed to hold its breath, in anticipation of the arrival of the golden sun. On one particularly awful Sunday, I decided I would try to win them over through sheer effort. I would create a peace offering out of flour and butter and herbs. I spent the entire afternoon cooking an elaborate meal: a perfectly roasted chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, homemade gravy, and a freshly baked apple pie for dessert. The house smelled warm and wonderful. I set the table with the good china and the cloth napkins. For a brief, naive moment, I allowed myself to hope that this gesture would be seen. I hoped they would look at the beautiful meal, at the effort I had put in, and see me not as a burden, but as a contributing member of the family. That hope disintegrated the moment Kyle's luxury SUV pulled into the driveway. My mother's face lit up as if someone had flipped a switch. She rushed to the door, flinging it open before he could even ring the bell. "They're here," she called out, her voice filled with a joy I hadn't heard all week. The greetings at the door were a carefully choreographed performance. Kyle received a long, warm hug. His wife, Sarah, got air kisses and a compliment on her new handbag. My father emerged from his study to slap Kyle on the back with a booming, "There's my boy." I came out of the kitchen, wiping my hands on my apron, and received a cursory, "Oh, hi, Jessica," from my mother before her attention snapped right back to Kyle's children. We all sat down at the table, the beautiful meal I had prepared spread out before us. "Wow, smells great in here," Kyle commented to the room at large, as if the food had magically appeared. My father carved the chicken and piled it onto Kyle's plate first, and then the conversation began, and as always, it orbited entirely around the sun. "So, I finally closed that big real estate deal I was telling you about," Kyle announced, taking a large bite of chicken. "The commission alone is more than most people make in a year." "Oh, Kyle, that's fantastic," my mother gushed, her eyes shining with pride. "We are so proud of you. You work so incredibly hard." My father nodded, his expression serious and admiring. "That's my son, a real provider. You're setting your family up for life." For the next 20 minutes, they talked about the deal, about the stock market, about the economy, about Kyle's plans to use his bonus to take the family on a lavish trip to Hawaii. I sat in silence, mechanically lifting my fork to my mouth, the food I had cooked tasting like nothing. I felt like a ghost at the table, a specter they could all see through. I could have been a coat rack, and the conversation would have been the same. After a while, Sarah, my sister-in-law, turned to me. She had a way of asking questions that sounded innocent but were actually tiny, poisoned darts. "It must be so nice to have all this free time to cook, Jessica," she said, a sweet fake smile on her face. I'm so busy with the kids and work. I can barely find time to boil water. My mother seized the opportunity. Well, some of us have important responsibilities, Sarah, she said, pointedly not looking at me. Then, her gaze finally landed on me, cold and appraising. Her voice became unnaturally loud, as if she were making an announcement. So, Jessica, anything to report? Still sending out those little applications? Found anything yet? The table fell silent. Everyone looked at me. It was an interrogation. I felt my face flush, a hot tide of shame rising up my neck. I tried to keep my voice even and professional, to present myself as a competent adult, and not the charity case they saw me as. Actually, yes, I said, looking my mother in the eye. I had a third-round interview with a tech company for a full-time remote position as a user experience designer. It went really well, and I just landed a big freelance project with a firm in California. I felt a tiny flicker of pride. These were real achievements. It was progress. But my mother extinguished that flicker with a single, dismissive word. Freelance, she sniffed, as if I had said I was selling seashells by the seashore. She shook her head and looked at my father, a look of shared disappointment passing between them. You know, Robert, she said, her voice dripping with meaning. When we were 29, we owned this house. We had a mortgage, 2 cars, and a baby on the way. We were building a life. My father nodded gravely. You have to be practical. Jessica, we were building a family, a real life. Even Kyle decided to chime in, leaning back in his chair with a look of smug authority. The creative world is a tough racket, Jess, he said, calling me by a nickname he only used when he was about to be condescending. It's just not very stable. You need a real career path. They were all against me, a unified front of disapproval. The beautiful meal I had so carefully prepared was the centerpiece of my own humiliation. They were eating the food I had made while systematically dismantling my worth, my choices, and my life. I felt an overwhelming urge to stand up, to scream, to throw my plate against the wall, but I didn't. I had been conditioned for years to swallow my anger, to keep the peace, to absorb the blows without complaint. So I just sat there, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. I stared down at my plate, at the swirl of gravy next to the mashed potatoes, focusing on it as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. I couldn't look at any of them. After a few moments of thick, uncomfortable silence, my father cleared his throat and turned back to Kyle. So, about that Hawaii trip, he said. And just like that, the conversation moved on. I had been assessed, judged, and dismissed. The ghost was invisible once more. Later that evening, as I stood alone in the kitchen washing a mountain of dishes, I could hear their laughter from the living room. They were watching a movie together, a happy family enjoying a Sunday night. They hadn't offered to help. They hadn't thanked me for the meal. It was as if I were the hired help, and my duties were now complete. As I scrubbed the hardened gravy from a plate, a single hot tear rolled down my cheek and fell into the soapy water. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, helpless rage. The 3 days that followed that Sunday dinner were cold and silent. The air in the house was thick with unspoken words, a heavy, suffocating blanket of resentment. My mother communicated with me only through curt, single-word answers or by pointedly speaking to my father while I was in the room. Robert, can you tell Jessica the dishwasher needs to be emptied? She would say, her back to me. My father would just avoid me altogether, disappearing into his study or the garage whenever I entered a room. I felt like a prisoner of war in a country that used to be my home. I spent most of my time hiding in my room, the mattress on the floor feeling more and more like a symbol of my lowly status. The pressure was building, the house itself groaning under the strain. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark arrived on Wednesday evening in the form of my brother. He stopped by unexpectedly on his way home from work, dressed in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. He walked in with an air of casual ownership, calling out, "Anyone home?" as if I weren't a person who might answer. He was there to drop off some paperwork for my father, but he decided to stay for dinner. His presence immediately amplified the tension in the room to an unbearable level. The 4 of us sat in the living room before dinner, a parody of a normal family. My parents fawned over Kyle, asking about his day. He launched into a long, boring story about a difficult client he had won over with his brilliant negotiating skills. I sat on the edge of an armchair, pretending to read a magazine, my body rigid with anxiety. The conversation was a carefully constructed performance for my benefit. They talked about the importance of a strong work ethic, the value of a steady paycheck, the foolishness of chasing unrealistic dreams. They never used my name, but every word was a bullet aimed directly at me. "It's just about being a grown-up," Kyle said, leaning forward with a look of profound wisdom on his face. "You reach a point where you have to stop relying on handouts and make your own way in the world. It's called responsibility." "Exactly," my mother said, nodding emphatically. "Some people just never learn that." I could feel my blood starting to boil. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I was paying them rent. I was their live-in cook, cleaner, and babysitter. But in their narrative, I was a freeloader. I turned a page of my magazine with a sound that was a little too loud. Kyle glanced over at me, a flicker of a smile on his face. He was enjoying this. He was the prosecutor, and my parents were the jury, and they had all decided on the verdict long before. The trial began. When I got up to set the table for dinner, the atmosphere followed me into the dining room. I moved with quiet, deliberate motions, placing the plates and silverware down with painstaking care, trying to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible. I could still hear them in the other room, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur. I was lining up the forks when Kyle's voice rose, carrying a clear, joking tone that was designed to be overheard. "You know," he said, his voice laced with mock sympathy, "some people just can't handle the real world. They think they can just draw pictures and life will take care of itself." My mother's laugh was the sound of a gunshot in the quiet house. It was loud, sharp, and utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of a dam breaking. I froze, my hand hovering over the last napkin. I squeezed my eyes shut. "Don't react," I told myself. "Don't give them the satisfaction." But it was too late. My mother walked into the dining room, her face flushed, her eyes glittering with a strange, manic energy. She saw me standing there, and the last shred of her control seemed to snap. The fake smile fell from her face, replaced by a snarl of pure contempt. It was as if all the years of her disappointment in me, every B on a report card, every art project she didn't understand, every career choice she saw as a mistake, had finally coalesced into a single moment of pure hatred. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He is right," she hissed, her voice low and shaking with rage. "He is absolutely right. You waltz back into this house with your failed career and your sad little life, and you expect us to just clean up your mess." I finally found my voice. It was small and shaky, but it was there. "That's not true," I whispered. "I help out. I pay for—" "Don't you dare!" she shrieked, cutting me off. Her voice suddenly rose to a terrifying volume. "Don't you dare stand in my house and tell me what you do. I have done nothing but work my entire life to give you and your brother everything, and he appreciates it. He built a life. What have you done? Nothing. You contribute nothing. You sit in that room all day, playing on your computer, waiting for us to feed you." The injustice of her words was like a punch to the gut. Every meal I had cooked, every dish I had washed, every dollar I had given them, she had erased it all. "You are useless," she screamed, her face turning a blotchy red. "You are a leech. That's what you are. You are just a leech living off us." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Before I could process the sheer violence of it, she spun around and sprinted up the stairs. I heard her slam the door to my room open. There were sounds of frantic, furious movement, drawers being yanked open, hangers scraping, objects being thrown. My father and Kyle had appeared in the doorway to the dining room, silent spectators to my execution. My father's face was pale and slack. He wouldn't look at me. Kyle, however, watched the scene unfold with a look of cold, clinical interest. A moment later, my mother reappeared at the top of the stairs, dragging my 2 duffel bags. Her hair was wild, and she was panting for breath. She didn't stop. She thundered down the stairs, the bags bumping heavily behind her. She marched past me, her eyes fixed on the front door. She threw it open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. With a final guttural scream of pure rage, she hurled my bags one after the other out onto the porch. My box of art supplies, the one thing I had managed to save, followed them, landing with a sickening crunch. "Get out!" she shrieked, her voice raw. "Get out of my house and don't you ever come back." She stood there in the open doorway, her chest heaving, framed by the dark night. I looked from her contorted face to my father's, then to my brother's. I searched their eyes one last time, a desperate, silent plea for someone to stop this, for someone to say this had gone too far. I found nothing. My father turned his back to me and walked slowly into the living room. My brother offered no such subtlety. He looked me right in the eye, and the smirk I saw on his face was one of pure, unadulterated victory. The front door slammed shut, the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place like the final nail in a coffin. The house was silent. I was left, standing alone in the entryway, the echoes of my mother's rage still vibrating in the air. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, my mind a complete and utter blank. Then slowly, I turned. I unlocked the door she had just slammed, walked out onto the porch, and gently closed it behind me. I didn't look back. I walked down the steps, gathered my broken and scattered belongings from the wet lawn, and walked away into the cold, dark street. The cold was the first thing that truly registered. Not the emotional shock, not the humiliation, but the raw, physical cold of the damp Portland night seeping through my thin sweater. I stood on the sidewalk, the broken straps of my duffel bags digging into my shoulders, and watched the warm, yellow squares of light in the windows of my former home. Inside, they were probably sitting down to the dinner I had set the table for, the scent of the food I had helped prepare still lingering in the air. The thought was so absurd, so monstrous, that a single hysterical laugh escaped my lips before I choked it back down. For a long moment, I didn't know what to do. My mind was a blizzard of white noise. Every logical thought was buried under an avalanche of pain and confusion. Where do I go? What do I do? The questions were huge and terrifying. I started walking, with no destination in mind, just moving away from that house. The streetlights cast long, distorted shadows on the pavement, and my own shadow seemed to mock me, a hunched, pathetic figure dragging its worldly possessions in 2 torn bags. Each step was an effort. My legs felt like they were filled with lead, and a deep, shuddering chill had taken root in my bones. After walking for what felt like an hour, I found myself at a bus stop. The plastic bench was cold and wet, but I sank onto it, my body too exhausted to stand any longer. I dropped my bags at my feet and just sat there, watching the cars rush past, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Each car held people, going somewhere, going home. The word felt like a foreign country I had just been deported from. I pulled out my phone. The screen lit up, showing a picture of me and my 2 nephews, smiling on a sunny day at the park. A fresh wave of grief washed over me. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over names. My entire family, aunts, uncles, cousins, they were all tied to my parents. Calling any of them would be useless. The story would be twisted, and I would be painted as the ungrateful, dramatic daughter who had caused a scene. They would all take my parents' side. They always did. There was only one person I could think of, Maya, my best friend since college. She was fierce and loyal and had always seen the cracks in my family's perfect facade. But making the call felt like a monumental task. It meant admitting how bad things were. It meant saying the words out loud, making the nightmare real. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the screen. She answered on the second ring. "Hey, Jess. What's up?" Her voice was so normal, so cheerful, it was like a dispatch from another universe. "Maya?" My own voice was a cracked, unfamiliar whisper. "It's me." The cheerfulness in her voice vanished, replaced instantly with concern. "Jess? Are you okay? You sound awful." I started, but a sob caught in my throat. I couldn't speak. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice sharp and focused. "Just tell me where you are." I managed to read the name of the street off the bus stop sign. "I'm at the corner of Hawthorne and 12th, I choked out. Something happened at my parents' house." "Stay right there," she commanded. "Don't move. I'm coming to get you. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She hung up, and I was left in the silence again, but it felt different now. A tiny pinprick of light had appeared in the suffocating darkness. I just had to hold on for 10 minutes. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop shaking, and waited. True to her word, Maya's beat-up Honda pulled up to the curb exactly 10 minutes later. She jumped out of the car before it had even fully stopped, her face a mask of worry. She took one look at me, huddled on the bench with my bags, and her expression hardened into a quiet fury. She didn't ask a lot of questions. She just wrapped me in a hug that felt like it was holding my broken pieces together. "Come on," she said softly, her voice thick with an anger that was entirely on my behalf. "Let's get you out of here." She threw my bags in the back of her car and helped me into the passenger seat. She turned the heat on full blast, and as the warm air washed over my frozen hands, I finally started to cry. It wasn't loud or dramatic, It was a silent, exhausted weeping, tears tracking down my cold cheeks as Maya drove through the city streets, one hand on the wheel and the other resting reassuringly on my arm. Maya's apartment was a small one-bedroom, cluttered with books and half-finished paintings, but it felt like a palace. It was warm and safe. She sat me down on her worn-out, comfortable couch and wrapped a thick quilt around my shoulders. She made me a cup of peppermint tea, pressing the warm mug into my hands. "You don't have to talk about it until you're ready," she said, her voice gentle. "But you're staying here for as long as you need. This is your home now." That night, lying on her couch, I couldn't sleep. The city lights filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face, contorted with rage. I heard her voice screaming that word, Leech. It echoed in the quiet apartment, a brand seared into my mind. I replayed the scene over and over, the slam of the door, my father's averted eyes, my brother's smirk. The betrayal was a physical thing, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stayed with Maya for a week, and she was a miracle of friendship. She fed me, let me borrow her clothes, and sat with me in silence when I couldn't talk. But her apartment was small, and I felt the familiar creeping sense of being a burden. I knew I couldn't stay forever. With a heavy heart, I called another friend, Liam, who had a spare room since his roommate had just moved out. He immediately said yes. Moving from Maya's couch to Liam's spare room felt like another step down. Liam was kind, but his apartment was a typical bachelor pad, messy and loud. I spent my days at the public library using their computers to apply for jobs, and my nights trying to sleep through the sound of his video games. After 2 weeks, his new roommate was set to move in, and I had to move again, this time to the couch of an old college acquaintance, Sarah, who lived in a tiny studio apartment. I was officially a couch surfer, living out of my duffel bags, a guest in everyone's life and the protagonist of none. This period was my rock bottom. Each morning I would wake up in a strange place, disoriented, with the same heavy stone of grief in my stomach. The humiliation was constant. I was deeply grateful for my friends' generosity, but their kindness only highlighted my own desperate situation. I was a 29-year-old woman with a college degree, sleeping on couches, washing my clothes in laundromats, and eating cheap takeout. My family had not just thrown me out of their house, they had thrown me out of the world. The pain of their rejection was still there, a raw, open wound, but underneath it, something new was beginning to form. It was a hard, cold, quiet anger. It was the anger of a survivor. They had pushed me out of the nest, expecting me to fall. But as I lay on that lumpy studio couch listening to the traffic outside, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not fall. I would learn to fly. The turning point didn't happen in a flash of lightning or a dramatic epiphany. It was a quiet, cold moment of clarity on a Tuesday morning in Sarah's tiny studio apartment. I was sitting at her small kitchen table, which was also her desk and her dining table, nursing a cup of cheap instant coffee and staring at my laptop screen. Another rejection email had just come in. It was polite, generic, and utterly soul-crushing. That was the 10th one that week. I felt the familiar sting of despair, the urge to just close the laptop, crawl back onto the couch, and disappear under the blankets. But then, something shifted. I looked around the tiny apartment, at my duffel bags slumped in the corner like sleeping dogs. I thought about the pitying looks from my friends, the constant feeling of being in the way, the deep, gnawing shame that had become my constant companion, and the anger I had been simmering in for weeks finally boiled over into a cold, hard resolve. I was done feeling sorry for myself. I was done being a victim. My family had written me off as a failure. My mother's scream of "Leech" was the final word in their story about me, but it wouldn't be the final word in mine. I would write my own ending. That morning, I stopped looking for other people to hire me and decided to hire myself. I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it My Own Damn Business. I thought about the freelance project in California I had mentioned at that last horrible Sunday dinner. It was a real project, one that I had been excited about before my life imploded. I sent them an email explaining that I had recently left my previous position and could now dedicate my full attention to their project, effective immediately. To my shock, they replied within an hour, thrilled. That project became my lifeline. It was the one thing in my chaotic, untethered life that I could control. I poured every ounce of my energy and focus into it. My days fell into a new rhythm. I would wake up early, before Sarah, and walk to a small, independent coffee shop a few blocks away. I would buy the cheapest black coffee they had, find a corner table, and work for hours. I designed logos, built wireframes, and created brand guidelines. The work was challenging and engaging. For the first time in months, I felt competent. I felt useful. In the world of pixels and color palettes, I wasn't a homeless failure. I was a professional designer, and I was good at my job. The coffee shop became my office, my sanctuary. The baristas got to know me, and the familiar, friendly nod they gave me each morning was a small anchor in my turbulent life. I worked relentlessly, fueled by caffeine and a desperate need to prove my family wrong. I wasn't just working for a client. I was working for my own survival, for my own self-respect. A month later, I submitted the final designs for the California project. I was so nervous I felt sick. I had put everything I had into it. The next day, an email from the client arrived. They loved it. They absolutely loved it. And at the bottom of the email was a notification from PayPal. A payment of several $1,000s had just been deposited into my account. I stared at the number on the screen, and for the first time since that night on the porch, I cried tears of joy. It wasn't just money. It was proof. It was validation. It was a giant, blinking sign from the universe that my skills had value, that I had value, independent of my family's judgment. That night, I took Maya out for dinner at a nice restaurant. I paid the bill with my own money, earned from my own talent. It was the best meal I had ever tasted. That first success became a stepping stone. I used the designs from that project to build a professional online portfolio. I started reaching out to other businesses, marketing myself as a freelance, brand identity, and web designer. I got a few small jobs at first, then a few bigger ones. My confidence grew with each completed project, with each happy client. I was working 12-hour days, but it didn't feel like a grind. It felt like I was building something, brick by painful brick, a new life. Then, one afternoon, as I was working in my usual coffee shop, an email arrived with a subject line that made my heart stop. Job offer. UX designer, Orbit Tech. It was the tech company I had interviewed with right before I was thrown out, the one my mother had been so dismissive of. I had assumed that ship had long since sailed. I opened the email with trembling hands. They had been following my freelance work online through my portfolio, and they were even more impressed. They were offering me a full-time, fully remote position with a salary that was almost double what I had been making at my old job. I read the email 3 times to make sure it was real. A full-time job, a real salary, benefits, the stability I had been desperately craving. I took a deep, shuddering breath and wrote back a single professional sentence. Thank you for the offer. I am delighted to accept. The first thing I did with my signing bonus was find my own apartment. The search was a joyful, liberating experience. I wasn't looking for anything fancy or big. I was just looking for 4 walls and a door that I could lock. A space that was entirely, unequivocally mine. I found it in a small 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick building, with a big window that looked out onto a quiet, leafy street. I'll never forget the feeling of signing. The lease. The landlord handing me my own set of keys. I walked into the empty apartment and the door clicked shut behind me. The silence was profound. It wasn't the lonely silence of a friend's couch. It was the peaceful silence of my own home. I had no furniture, just my duffel bags and a newly purchased air mattress. I spent that first night on the floor, wrapped in a new blanket, staring out the big window at the stars. A profound sense of peace settled over me. I had done it. I had survived. I had built a life for myself, out of the ashes of the one that had been burned down. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought echoed in my mind, a quiet, powerful mantra of my newfound freedom. No one could ever throw me out again. The next 3 months were a period of quiet, steady reconstruction. My life began to take on a new shape, one that I was designing myself. My days were structured around my new job. I set up a small, dedicated office space in the corner of my living room with a proper desk and a comfortable chair. Small luxuries. That felt like the height of opulence. I was good at my job, and my team at Orbit Tech was supportive and brilliant. For the first time in my career, I felt respected for my skills and ideas. My professional confidence, so long battered and bruised, began to heal. I slowly started furnishing my apartment, piece by piece. I bought a real bed, a comfortable couch, and a small dining table. Each item was chosen carefully, a deliberate act of creating a home that was a reflection of me, not of anyone else's expectations. I filled the space with plants and with my own art, which I had started making again. The apartment became my sanctuary, a place where I could be completely, unapologetically myself. The silence was no longer something to be filled, but something to be cherished. I had made a clean break from my family. Immediately after getting my own place and a new phone number, I had blocked all of them. My mother, my father, my brother. I had no desire to speak to them, no need for a dramatic confrontation. Their actions on that cold night had been a final, definitive statement. The door they had slammed in my face was a door I had no intention of ever knocking on again. My friends Maya and Liam were my family now. We had regular dinners, went on hikes, and celebrated each other's small victories. I was building a new support system, one based on mutual respect and genuine affection. I was finally at peace. The constant, low-grade anxiety that had been the background noise of my entire life had faded. The wound my family had inflicted was still there, a scar that would likely never disappear completely, but it no longer ached with the same intensity. It was a part of my history, a reminder of the fire I had walked through. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a notification popped up on my laptop screen. It was an iMessage, which was connected to my Apple ID and therefore bypassed the block on my phone number. The message was from my father. My heart did a painful little flip-flop in my chest, an involuntary reaction to seeing his name. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the trackpad, debating whether to just delete it without reading. Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked it open. The message was short and devoid of any greeting. It just said, "Why is our bank account locked? We can't get in." I stared at the words, a strange mix of confusion and adrenaline coursing through me. Locked? What was he talking about? I hadn't done anything. And then, a memory, fuzzy at first, began to sharpen in my mind. It was from about 2 years ago, a memory I had long since filed away. It came back to me in a rush. I was at my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon, summoned for a tech support session. They had decided they finally needed to embrace online banking, but they were hopelessly inept with technology. My father had spent an hour trying to set it up himself, getting increasingly frustrated and angry at the computer screen. Kyle, of course, was far too busy with his important job to be bothered with something so trivial. So, as always, the task fell to me, the daughter with the useless computer skills. I remembered the scene vividly. I sat at their cluttered kitchen table with their laptop, my mother peering nervously over my shoulder. "I just don't trust this stuff," she kept saying. "What if someone steals our money? It's perfectly safe, Mom. You just need a strong password," I had explained for the 5th time. I walked them through the whole process, setting up a username, choosing a password they could remember, which took an absurdly long time, and setting up the security questions. Then came the final, crucial step, the 2-factor authentication and account recovery settings. "It's going to ask for a phone number and an email address," I explained. "If you ever get locked out or forget your password, it will send a code to that number or email so you can get back in." My father had scoffed. "Well, don't use our numbers. We'll just lose the codes or delete them by accident. Your mother deletes every text message she doesn't recognize. Just use yours, honey," my mother had said, patting my arm. "You're the only one who understands how all this computer nonsense works. It'll be easier if it's just connected to you." At the time, I hadn't thought anything of it. It was just another instance of me being the family's unpaid IT department, the convenient one, the one they turned to when their own limitations became frustrating. I had typed in my own phone number and my personal email address without a second thought, set everything up, and showed them how to log in. They had probably forgotten about it the moment I walked out the door, but I hadn't. Sitting in my peaceful, quiet apartment, I remembered. The account was in their name, but the digital keys, the only keys that mattered in a lockout situation, were in my possession. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated irony. For years, they had called me impractical, irresponsible, a failure. They had mocked my career, my skills, my entire way of life. They had treated me as a burden, a parasite, a leech. And now, their entire financial life, their mortgage payments, their bills, Their access to the money they valued above all else was completely and utterly dependent on the daughter they had thrown out into the street. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. I looked at my father's terse, demanding message again. There was no, hello, no, how are you, no, I'm sorry. Just a demand for a solution. The same old dynamic. But I wasn't the same person anymore. I was no longer the daughter who would jump to solve their problems, desperate for a crumb of approval. I let the message sit there for hours. I made myself a cup of tea. I continued with my workday. I let them wonder. I let them panic. I thought about all the years of dismissal, all the casual cruelty, all the calculated humiliation. I thought about that final, terrible night. Then, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across my living room, I clicked back to the message window. My fingers were steady as I typed my reply. It was short, it was brutal, and it was perfect. I typed 2 words, took a deep breath and hit send. Ask the leech. The silence after I sent the text was electric. I imagined the message landing on my father's phone, the confusion in his eyes, the dawning horror as he and my mother finally understood. I had taken their ugliest word and thrown it right back in their faces. For a few hours, there was nothing. I pictured the frantic, whispered conversations, the failed attempts to call the bank's customer service, the growing panic as they realized they were truly, completely locked out. I felt a cold, hard satisfaction that was entirely new to me. It wasn't happiness, but it was a form of justice. Then, the storm broke. My laptop, still open to my messaging app, began to buzz incessantly. A rapid-fire series of texts from my father came through, each one more frantic than the last. Jessica, this isn't funny. What is that supposed to mean? Your mother is having a panic attack. You need to call us right now. This is our money. You have no right to do this. I read the messages without emotion, a detached observer watching a predictable drama unfold. I didn't reply. A few minutes later, the calls started. I watched my laptop screen as my father's name flashed again and again. I ignored each call, letting them all go to voicemail. After the 5th missed call, a notification popped up. He had left a message. Out of a morbid curiosity, I clicked play. His voice was tight with anger and panic. Jessica, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it stops now. Call me back immediately. You need to fix this. It was a command, not a request. The same tone he had used with me my entire life. A few minutes later, my mother called. I ignored it. Her voicemail was exactly what I expected. A torrent of hysterical, furious accusations. How dare you? How could you be so vindictive, so cruel? This is our retirement money. You are a horrible, ungrateful child. You will fix this right now, do you hear me? Right now. I listened to both messages and felt nothing but a profound sense of distance. It was like listening to angry strangers. Their words had no power over me anymore. Their panic was a problem of their own making. The next voicemail from my father, an hour later, was different. The anger was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading tone I had never heard from him before. Jess, please, I'm sorry. We have bills due. The mortgage payment is scheduled for tomorrow. It's an automatic withdrawal. If the account is locked, it won't go through. Please, just tell us what to do. We don't understand this technology. Then came a text from Kyle. Mom and Dad are freaking out. Whatever childish game you're playing, you need to knock it off and fix it. You're being incredibly selfish. The audacity of his message, calling me childish and selfish after he had stood by and smirked as I was thrown onto the street, was breathtaking. This time, I did reply. My fingers flew across the keyboard. This has nothing to do with you, Kyle. This is between me and the people whose accounts I am apparently in control of. Stay out of it. I blocked his number and then went about my evening. I made dinner. I watched a movie. I let them stew in the crisis they had created. This wasn't about revenge, I realized. Revenge was messy and emotional. This was about consequences. For my entire life, my actions had consequences, but theirs never did. Until now I let them panic for another full day. The messages and voicemails continued, each one more desperate than the last. Finally, on Thursday evening, I saw my father's name flash on the screen again. I decided it was time. I took a deep, calming breath, let the call connect, and put the phone on speaker. Hello? I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. Jessica. My father's voice was a flood of relief and desperation. Oh, thank God. Jessica, you have to help us. We're so sorry. We don't know what to do. I see, I said, keeping my tone neutral. The mortgage payment didn't go through. We got a notice from the bank. Your mother hasn't slept. In 2 days. Please, whatever we did, we're sorry. Just tell us how to fix this. Here it was. The moment of truth. I could have given them the password. I could have walked them through the recovery process over the phone. I could have ended their panic in 5 minutes. But that wouldn't change anything. In a week, they would forget their desperation and remember only my inconvenience. The dynamic would reset. I wasn't going to let that happen. I'll help you, I said, and I could hear him exhale in relief on the other end of the line. But not over the phone, and not for free. Free? We'll pay you, whatever you want, he said quickly. I don't want your money, I said, my voice turning to ice. I've been making my own, remember? The price for my help isn't financial. You want me to fix this? Then you will meet me in person. Okay, yes, of course. We can come over right now. No, I said firmly. Not at my home. We will meet tomorrow at noon, at the Caffeinated Bean on Morrison Street. It's a public place. You will both be there. Okay, we'll be there, he said, desperate to agree. And there's one more condition, I continued, my voice low and serious. This is the most important part. When we meet, the first thing you are going to do, before we even talk about the bank, is you are going to apologize to me. You are going to apologize for calling me a leech and for throwing me and my belongings out of your house. You will say the words. You will admit what you did, and you will do it without excuses or justifications. That is the price for my help. You give me the truth and I'll give you access to your money. Do you understand? The line went silent. I could hear his breathing, heavy and ragged. I could picture him, phone pressed to his ear, the demand hanging in the air between us. He was probably looking at my mother, whose pride was as vast and fragile as an iceberg. This was their moment to choose, their money or their pride. I heard muffled talking in the background, my mother's raised, frantic whispers. Then my father came back on the line. His voice was different. All the fight, all the bluster was gone. It was the voice of a man completely and utterly defeated. He started, and his voice cracked. He cleared his throat. We do need you, Jessica. The admission, after a lifetime of being told I was useless, was a quiet explosion in my soul. Noon tomorrow, I said, my voice steady. Don't be late. I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't feeling triumphant or vengeful. I was feeling something far more powerful. I was feeling in control. For the first time in my life, I was the one setting the terms. I arrived at the cafe at 5 minutes to noon. I chose a small table in the back corner, a spot that gave me a clear view of the entrance but also a sense of privacy. I ordered a black coffee and sat, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, my back straight. I was not the nervous, defeated girl who used to sit silently at their dinner table. I was a stranger they were coming to meet for a business transaction. My heart was beating a steady, calm rhythm. I was ready. They walked in at noon exactly. They looked lost and out of place. My father's shoulders were slumped, and he looked older than I had ever seen him. My mother was pale, her face etched with lines of stress and sleeplessness. She clutched her handbag like a shield. They scanned the cafe, and when their eyes landed on me, they flinched, as if they were seeing a ghost. Slowly, they made their way to my table and sat down without a word. The silence was thick and awkward. My father fiddled with a sugar packet. My mother stared at the tabletop. They were waiting for me to speak, to lead, as I always had. I did not. I simply took a slow sip of my coffee and waited. This was their meeting to run, their apology to give. Finally, my father cleared his throat. Jessica, he began, his voice raspy. We are... He couldn't seem to get the words out. He looked at my mother for help, but she refused to meet his gaze. I looked at them, my expression unreadable. I told you the terms, I said, my voice quiet but firm. The apology comes first. Or I walk out that door and you can figure out your banking problems with Kyle. The mention of Kyle's name seemed to do the trick. A flash of fear crossed their faces. They knew he couldn't help them. My mother took a shaky breath. She still wouldn't look at me, but she spoke, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. I'm sorry. Sorry for what? I pressed, my voice still quiet, but unyielding. I need to hear you say it. Her jaw tightened. This was the hardest part for her, the surrender of her pride. A tear escaped the corner of her eye and tracked down her cheek. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words sounding like they were being torn from her throat. I'm sorry for what I said, for calling you that word, and for throwing you out. My father seemed to find his voice after she had broken the seal. He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine shame in his eyes. She's right, Jess. I'm sorry too. I'm sorry I stood there and let it happen. It was wrong. I held their gaze for a long moment, letting the words settle in the air. It wasn't a perfect apology. It wasn't filled with the deep understanding or remorse I might have dreamed of, but it was what I had asked for. It was the truth. It was an admission of their guilt. And for now, it was enough. I nodded slowly. Thank you. Then, I pulled my laptop out of my bag and placed it on the table. Okay, I said, my tone shifting to one of brisk efficiency. Let's fix this. For the next 10 minutes I worked. I had them reset their password through my email. I walked them through the process of changing their security questions, and most importantly, updating the recovery contacts to my father's new, barely used smartphone. As I worked, I explained every step in simple, clear language. I was a patient, detached IT consultant. When it was done, and they had successfully logged into their account on my father's phone, a visible wave of relief washed over them. The tension in their shoulders eased. They finally had their security back. Then, I did one last thing. I went deep into the account settings, to the administrative controls. I found my own name, still listed as a secondary user with full permissions from when I had first set up the account. With 2 clicks, I deleted myself. A small pop-up asked, "Are you sure you want to remove this user?" I clicked, yes. I closed my laptop and began to pack my bag. "What did you just do?" my father asked, a note of suspicion in his voice. "I removed myself from your account," I said calmly, zipping my bag shut. "I no longer have any access or control. From now on, you'll have to manage your own banking. Or Kyle can help you." I stood up. "My part of our transaction is complete." They stared at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. They had expected me to hold this power over them, to perhaps demand something more. They didn't understand that the power was a prison I wanted no part of. My mother finally spoke, her voice small. Will you come for dinner on Sunday?" The question was so absurd, so completely disconnected from the reality of what had happened, that I almost laughed. They thought an apology and a bank rescue had fixed everything, that we could just rewind the clock and go back to pretending. We were a family. I looked at her, and for the first time I felt not anger, but a profound, sad pity. "No, Mom," I said softly. "I won't." I turned and walked away without waiting for a reply, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of the family they had broken. I didn't look back. That night, I sat in my quiet apartment, the one I paid for with the job I had earned. The city lights twinkled outside my window. I lit a single candle and watched the flame dance, a small, steady point of light in the darkness. I didn't feel a rush of victory or a thrill of revenge. I felt a deep, peaceful, and liberating calm. They had called me a leech, a burden who couldn't survive without them. But the truth was, I had been the one holding them up all along, in ways they never even saw. My revenge wasn't in locking them out of their bank account. My true revenge was in building a life so full and so stable that I didn't need anything from them ever again. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their apologies. And I certainly didn't need their love. I needed freedom. And I had finally taken it for myself. If you've ever been labeled a burden when you were the one holding everything together, you're not alone. Comment below, hit like, and subscribe for more stories like Jessica's.